The waiting did not take long, though it felt interminable to those on the lawn. Greenleaf Parva was not accustomed to suspense of this sort. It preferred the gentle kind, involving raffle tickets or the slow unveiling of an engagement. Now the air itself seemed tight, as though holding its breath. Inside the drawing-room, Dr. Reynolds stood guard with a proprietary air, while Major Harper stationed himself near the French windows, arms folded, a self-appointed sentry. Mrs. Compton hovered between rooms, wringing her hands and apologizing to everyone in general. Edith Langley remained where she was, just inside the doorway, her expression unreadable. Miss Marple took advantage of the stillness. She moved, not conspicuously, but with the quiet purpose of someone whose movements were rarely questioned. Her eyes returned to the escritoire. The porcelain figurine, a shepherdess with a chipped crook, was slightly askew. Miss Marple adjusted it delicately, and in doing so freed the folded letter beneath. She did not pick it up at once. Instead, she let her gaze skim the page where the fold had been pressed. A single word was visible, written in a firm, old-fashioned hand, Mill. How very careless, she thought, or very desperate. Behind her, Edith Langley shifted. Miss Marple could feel the movement, could sense the tension like a pulled thread. Without turning, she said mildly, "Such a pretty little desk. I expect it's been here for years." "It was my mother's," Mrs. Compton said at once, seizing upon the topic with relief. "She always kept her correspondence there. I can't imagine why Arthur Mr. Bellamy would have been writing letters in my drawing-room." "Perhaps he wasn't writing," Miss Marple said. "Perhaps he was reading." Edith Langley's voice came sharply. "He had no right." Mrs. Compton stared at her. "No right to what?" Edith hesitated, then lifted her chin, to stir things up, to bring the past into polite rooms and set it down among the teacups. Dr. Reynolds glanced between them. "Miss Langley, did you know Mr. Bellamy well?" "Well enough," Edith said. "He asked questions about the mill, about things that happened there before the war, about people who thought those things were forgotten." Major Harper frowned. "What things?" Edith looked at him with a peculiar, appraising expression. "You wouldn't know," she said. "You weren't here then." Miss Marple thought of the mud again, of riverbanks and sluices and paths no one admitted to using. On the lawn, voices rose and fell. Clara Wilmot sat on a garden bench with Peter Grant beside her, his arms still around her shoulders. She looked pale, her earlier brightness extinguished. When Miss Marple glanced her way through the window, Clara looked up suddenly, as though she felt the gaze, and their eyes met. For a fleeting instant, something passed across Clara's face, not grief, not fear, but calculation. It vanished at once, replaced by tears. Miss Marple returned her attention to the room. The letter still lay half-hidden. She reached for it at last, her fingers closing on the paper with care. It was heavier than expected, as though something small had been enclosed and removed. Before she could open it, the sound of an approaching car cut through the murmurs outside. Gravel crunched sharply, doors slammed. Inspector Craddock arrived with the air of a man who disliked being summoned to village theatrical, and suspected, from long experience, that they were never as simple as they pretended. He was a compact man with alert eyes, and a mouth inclined to skepticism. He took in the scene in a single glance, the body, the half-empty glass, the cluster of anxious faces. "Right," he said briskly. "Nobody move." "Dr. Reynolds?" Dr. Reynolds gave a succinct account. Inspector Craddock nodded, his gaze sharpening at the mention of bitter almonds. "Murder, then," he said without drama. "We'll see." His eyes landed on Miss Marple. "And who might you be, madam?" "Miss Marple," she said, pleasantly. "I live at the end of the lane. I was invited for tea." Inspector Craddock made a non-committal sound and turned to Mrs. Compton. "Now, Mrs. Compton, I'll need everyone's name and where they were at the time." Mrs. Compton clasped her hands. "Of course. Everyone was on the lawn. Arthur Mr. Bellamy came inside alone. I saw him cross the threshold." Inspector Craddock raised an eyebrow. "You saw him enter?" "Yes, well," Mrs. Compton faltered. "I saw him near the windows." "I assumed," Miss Marple spoke quietly. "I did not see him enter. Inspector Craddock turned back to her. "You said that earlier, didn't you?" "Who else was watching?" Major Harper shrugged. "I was talking to Mrs. Ellis near the tea table. Didn't notice who went in or out. Edith Langley said I was already standing here. I did not see him come through the windows." Inspector Craddock's gaze sharpened. "Then how did he get inside?" There was a small silence. "The side door," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Near the passage. It's often left unlatched." Mrs. Compton looked stricken. "I always keep it well, usually." Inspector Craddock made a note. "Who knew the house well enough to use it?" "Anyone local," Edith said. "Anyone who's been here more than once." Inspector Craddock moved closer to the body. He crouched, examining the shoes. "Mud," he observed. "Not garden mud." "No," Miss Marple agreed. He looked up at her sharply. "You noticed that?" "Yes." "And the print on the threshold outside doesn't match these shoes." Inspector Craddock straightened slowly. "Doesn't it?" Interesting. His eyes moved to the letter in Miss Marple's hand. "What's that?" "Oh," Miss Marple said, as though slightly embarrassed. "I found it on the desk. It seemed odd." Inspector Craddock took it. Unfolding it carefully, he read in silence, his expression altering. "Meeting at the old mill," he read aloud. "Today, 4 o'clock. Come alone. It must be finished." He looked up. "Finished," he repeated. From the lawn came a sudden, sharp laugh. Clara Wilmot had risen to her feet. "So that's it," she said, her voice carrying through the open windows. "All very melodramatic. The old mill. Secrets. How thrilling." Peter Grant stared at her. "Clara," Inspector Craddock stepped outside. "Miss Wilmot, you seem to find this amusing." Clara's smile wavered. "I find it ridiculous. That's all. Arthur Mr. Bellamy was always playing at mysteries. He liked to make people nervous." "Did he ask you to meet him today?" Inspector Craddock asked. Clara hesitated. "Just a fraction too long." "No," she said. Miss Marple watched her closely. Watched the way her hand twisted in her skirt. Watched the flicker of her eyes toward the spinney beyond the lawn. And in that moment Miss Marple was quite certain of one thing. Arthur Bellamy had not come into the drawing-room to die. He had come there because something had gone wrong elsewhere and someone had followed him inside to make very sure it stayed that way. Inspector Craddock took charge of the lawn with quiet authority, breaking the knot of villagers into smaller, more manageable clusters. Names were taken, movements noted, statements repeated with slight variations that interested him far more than the speakers realized. The garden, so recently the scene of polite sociability, had taken on a strained, artificial air, as though the roses themselves were listening. Miss Marple sat once more in her wicker chair, her knitting returned to her hands. The needles resumed their gentle clicking, a sound so domestic that it went largely unnoticed. She listened. Clara Wilmot had been guided to a chair near the hedge, where she dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that showed no sign of real use. Peter Grant hovered anxiously, answering questions with earnest precision. He had been with Clara most of the afternoon. No, he had not left her side. Yes, Arthur Bellamy had spoken to them briefly. No, he had not seemed upset. Only preoccupied. Major Harper gave his account briskly and with faint irritation. He disliked fuss and made no secret of it. Edith Langley, when questioned, spoke carefully, choosing her words as though each carried weight. She admitted freely that she had argued with Arthur Bellamy in the past. Yes, he had been persistent. Yes, she had told him to mind his own business. No, she had not met him today. Inspector Craddock absorbed it all, his face betraying little. At length he returned to the drawing-room, where the body had been covered with a sheet. Miss Marple followed more slowly, pausing at the threshold. The house felt altered now, as though it resented what had happened within its walls. Inspector Craddock examined the glass again, then the sideboard. "Who poured the sherry?" he asked. Mrs. Compton flushed. "I did. Earlier. Before anyone arrived. Arthur helped himself later." And the bottle? She indicated it. Inspector Craddock uncorked it and sniffed. His expression remained neutral. Could someone have added something to the glass afterward? He asked. Yes, Mrs. Compton said faintly. Anyone could have. Miss Marple glanced at the French windows, then at the side door beyond the passage. The house offered more than one quiet way in and out, especially to those who knew it. Inspector Craddock turned to her. You seem observant, Miss Marple. Did you notice anyone leaving the lawn? She considered. Not leaving entirely, but people do wander. To admire flowers, to fetch a wrap, or to speak privately. Privately with whom? Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. Arthur Bellamy was a man people wished to speak to quietly, or wished he would stop speaking to them. Inspector Craddock gave a short smile. You have a way with words. She returned the smile. Years of village life. Outside, voices rose again as the constable arrived to secure the house. The light was beginning to change. Afternoon sliding toward evening. Shadows lengthened across the lawn, darkening the paths between the hedges. Miss Marple watched them stretch and thought of the old mill by the river, damp and neglected, and of a meeting that had been meant to happen there instead. Whatever had been settled, she reflected, had been settled hurriedly and in the wrong place. By the time the body was removed, dusk had settled over Greenleaf Parva with deceptive gentleness. Lamps were lit in windows along the lane, and the village resumed the outward signs of order, though its pulse beat unevenly beneath them. Inspector Craddock remained at Mrs. Compton's house, methodically working his way through rooms that had known nothing more sinister than polished surfaces and careful hospitality. Miss Marple stayed as well. No one thought to send her home. Elderly ladies were generally assumed to be harmless fixtures like the furniture, and she made use of the assumption with quiet efficiency. In the passage near the side door, Inspector Craddock paused. This door, he said. You mentioned it's often unlatched. Mrs. Compton clasped her hands. I'm afraid so. Tradesman, deliveries one, can't be forever locking and unlocking. Inspector Craddock opened it and stepped out. The narrow path beyond ran alongside the hedge, worn thin by years of discreet use. He crouched, examining the ground. More mud, he observed. Same kind as on the victim's shoes. River mud, Miss Marple said, with reeds. He glanced up at her again, that sharp, measuring look. You know your mud. I walk, Miss Marple replied simply, and I pay attention. They returned indoors. In the drawing-room, the sheeted form lay stark against the rug, transformed from a shocking intrusion into a somber fact. Inspector Craddock moved to the desk once more, opening drawers, lifting papers. Mr. Bellamy was thorough, he said. He kept copies, notes, names. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. He liked to understand things fully, and people? She smiled faintly. Especially people. Inspector Craddock lifted a notebook. He'd been asking about the old mill. Ownership, accidents, a death years ago that was ruled misadventure. Edith Langley's voice came from the doorway. It was misadventure. Inspector Craddock did not turn. You're certain? I was there, Edith said. I saw what happened. Miss Marple watched her closely. Edith's hands were steady. Too steady. Inspector Craddock finally faced her. Then you won't mind telling me again, in detail. Edith met his gaze. I've told it before. A boy fell, slipped. The river was high. A boy who later became a man with money and questions, Inspector Craddock said mildly, or whose brother did. Edith's composure cracked, just slightly. You don't understand village things, she said sharply. You think because you found a secret, it must be a crime. Sometimes it is, he replied. Miss Marple intervened gently. Secrets often begin as mistakes, she said. It's what people do afterward that matters. Inspector Craddock studied her. And what do you think was done afterward? She did not answer directly. Her gaze drifted to the fireplace, where the poker leaned neatly in its stand. There was a faint smear near the handle, darker than soot. Someone was in a hurry, she said instead. They came from the river, not the lawn. They knew the house. They did not plan to kill him there, but when things went wrong, they adapted. Inspector Craddock followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. Outside, a door slammed. Voices murmured. Somewhere in the village, a clock struck the hour. Miss Marple folded her hands together, feeling the familiar tightening in her chest that came not from fear, but from recognition. The pattern was beginning to show itself now, not in evidence, but in behavior. And behavior, she knew, was where the truth always hid. Inspector Craddock's inquiries took on a more definite shape as the evening wore on. Lamps glowed warmly in Mrs. Compton's drawing room, throwing shadows that seemed to exaggerate every movement, every hesitation. The villagers who had remained were gathered in uneasy silence, each aware that attention might fall upon them at any moment. Clara Wilmot was the first to feel its full weight. Inspector Craddock seated himself opposite her, notebook balanced on one knee, his manner outwardly courteous. Peter Grant stood nearby, stiff with protective indignation. "You were close to Mr. Bellamy," Inspector Craddock said. "Several people have mentioned that." Clara gave a short, brittle laugh. "People mention all sorts of things. It's a village." "Were you meeting him today?" "No." The answer came quickly, too quickly. "He asked to speak to me earlier, that's all. He liked talking. He liked being interesting." "And did you agree to meet him at the mill?" Her eyes flicked up sharply. "No, of course not." Inspector Craddock waited. Silence stretched, pressing. "He said things," Clara went on, her voice rising defensively. "About my family. About money. He implied he could help or hurt. I told him to mind his own business." Peter Grant spoke up angrily. She was upset, he frightened her. Inspector Craddock nodded, making a note. "Yet Mr. Bellamy went to the mill anyway, and someone met him there." Clara's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied color. "You can't possibly think—" "I think nothing yet," Inspector Craddock said. "I observe." Miss Marple watched Clara's hands. They were clenched now, knuckles white, quite unlike the careless elegance she usually affected. Fear sat on her badly. It showed too clearly. Edith Langley was questioned next. She answered with composure, her voice controlled, almost cold. Yes, she had argued with Arthur Bellamy. Yes, she had told him not to pry. No, she had not gone near the mill that day. Her movements had been predictable, domestic, dull. Too dull, Miss Marple thought. Edith Langley was not a dull woman. Major Harper, by contrast, bristled at the implication that he might be involved. He produced an alibi supported by half the lawn, delivered with military precision. Inspector Craddock accepted it provisionally, though his eyes lingered on the man's face, as if filing it away for later consideration. Gradually, a narrative began to form among the murmurs. Clara Wilmot, young, ambitious, with something to lose. Arthur Bellamy, threatening exposure. A meeting gone wrong, poison, panic, improvisation. Inspector Craddock did not voice the theory outright, but it hovered in the room like a draught no one could quite shut out. Miss Marple felt the familiar discomfort that accompanied such moments. Villages loved obvious stories. They simplified. They chose the explanation that required the least rearrangement of their assumptions. She caught Edith Langley's eye across the room. Edith looked away at once. Later, as Inspector Craddock stepped aside to confer with his constable, Miss Marple found herself beside him. "You're thinking of arresting the girl," she said mildly. He did not deny it. "She fits. Motive. Opportunity, nerves." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "She does fit." Inspector Craddock studied her, but Miss Marple's smile was apologetic. "In my experience, Inspector, the person who fits too neatly often turns out to belong to quite another pattern." Before he could reply, Clara Wilmot let out a sudden, hysterical laugh that broke into sobs. Peter Grant rushed to her side, glowering at the room as though daring anyone to doubt her innocence. Miss Marple watched them both, her expression thoughtful. People in distress, she reflected, were very revealing indeed, but not always in the way one expected. Later that evening, when most of the villagers had been sent home with strict instructions to remain available, the house fell into an uneasy quiet. Inspector Craddock moved about with his constable, opening cupboards, checking doors, collecting objects with careful, gloved hands. Mrs. Compton sat rigidly in an armchair, looking as though her drawing-room had betrayed her personally. Miss Marple remained unobtrusive, which was to say that she remained exactly where she was most able to see and hear. Inspector Craddock returned to the desk once more, the contents now spread in a small, orderly array. "This letter," he said, tapping it lightly, "was folded around something. See the impression?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Something small and flat. Not a coin, too light. Paper," he suggested, "perhaps, or a key." Inspector Craddock looked at her sharply. "A key?" "Yes. Old mill buildings often have very particular locks. People keep keys for years, even when they tell themselves they've no reason to." Inspector Craddock made a note. "And where would such a key be now?" Miss Marple's eyes drifted, not the obvious places, but to the fireplace again. The poker had been returned neatly to its stand, but the faint smear she had noticed earlier was still there. "It might have been wiped away," she said gently. "If someone thought to do so." Inspector Craddock followed her gaze. He lifted the poker carefully. "There's something on this," he said. "Not soot. Mud, perhaps." "Dried." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "River mud dries darker." He frowned. "Why would anyone bring a poker from the drawing-room to the river?" "They wouldn't," Miss Marple said, "unless they'd brought something from the river into the drawing-room, something unpleasant they wished to dispose of." Inspector Craddock considered this. "You think the poison wasn't prepared here?" "No. I think the glass was an afterthought." Mrs. Compton made a small, distressed sound. "But the sherry could have been poured earlier," Miss Marple said soothingly, "and tampered with later." Inspector Craddock's gaze sharpened. "By someone who knew where everything was, who could move through the house without drawing attention." "Yes, Miss Langley," he said slowly. Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she said, "Do you remember what Miss Langley said earlier? That she was there, at the mill, when the accident happened?" "Yes, she has never said where she was standing, only that she saw." Inspector Craddock was silent. Miss Marple went on quietly. "People who truly witness accidents remember too much. Where the water was, how fast it moved, what someone shouted. Edith Langley remembers only the conclusion." Inspector Craddock closed his notebook. "You think she met him?" "I think she was summoned," Miss Marple said, "and that she went, meaning to end the matter with words. But words have a way of turning sharp when they've been held too long." Inspector Craddock exhaled slowly. "And Clara Wilmot was frightened," Miss Marple said. "And being frightened can look very like guilt." Inspector Craddock stood still for a moment, then moved toward the door. "I'd like to speak to Miss Langley again." As he went, Miss Marple returned to her knitting at last. The needles clicked softly, steadily. Patterns, she reflected, were rarely obvious at first glance. One had to look at the spaces between the stitches as well as the wool itself. And Edith Langley, for all her stillness, had left rather a great many spaces. Inspector Craddock found Edith Langley in the small parlour Mrs. Compton used for receiving tradesmen, seated upright on the edge of a chair as though she had chosen it deliberately for its lack of comfort. Her coat remained buttoned, her handbag clasped firmly in both hands. She looked prepared for questioning, for accusation, perhaps even for judgment, but not, Miss Marple observed from the doorway, for surprise. "You said you were at the mill years ago," Inspector Craddock began. "When the boy fell." Edith inclined her head. "I was, and Mr. Bellamy believed that incident was not an accident. He believed many things," Edith replied coolly. "Belief is not proof." "No," Inspector Craddock agreed, "but it can be motive." Edith's eyes flickered. "You think I killed him?" "I think you knew him," Inspector Craddock said, "and that he frightened you." For the first time, Edith's composure wavered. Not dramatically, only a slight tightening about the mouth, a fractional stiffening of the shoulders. "He threatened to reopen things that had cost people dearly," she said. "Reputations, livelihoods, peace." "And did you meet him today?" Inspector Craddock asked. Silence fell. It lingered long enough to be felt. "Yes," Edith said at last. "At the mill. He sent for me." Miss Marple watched closely now. "What happened there?" Inspector Craddock asked. Edith drew a slow breath. "We argued. He accused, I denied. He said he had proof." "What proof?" "A statement, a copy of a coroner's note. Something I had never seen before. And then I left," Edith said. "He was alive when I left." Inspector Craddock leaned forward. "Did you go to Mrs. Compton's house afterward?" "No." "Are you certain?" Edith hesitated. "I walked back through the spinney. I washed my hands in the stream. They were muddy." Miss Marple noted the phrasing. "Washed my hands. Not boots." Inspector Craddock said Mr. Bellamy was poisoned. Cyanide. Edith's eyes closed briefly. When they opened, something brittle showed through the calm. "Then someone else must have. You had opportunity," he said. "You had reason. And you know the house well." "Yes," Edith said quietly. "I know it well." Miss Marple stepped forward then, her voice gentle enough to soften the edges of the moment. "You were very careful with your words earlier," she said, "but not careful enough." Edith turned to her sharply. "What do you mean?" "You said you saw the boy fall," Miss Marple continued. "But the river bends there. One cannot see the water clearly from the path unless one is quite close." Edith's lips parted, then closed again. "You were closer than you ever admitted," Miss Marple said. "Close enough to know what really happened, and close enough today to know that Arthur Bellamy meant to expose it." Inspector Craddock watched Edith steadily. "Did you poison him?" Edith's hands tightened on her handbag. "No." Miss Marple believed her, and more importantly, so did Inspector Craddock. "But you went after him," the inspector said. "You followed him back." "Why?" Edith's voice dropped. "Because he took something from me. A key. One I'd kept for years. I wanted it back." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly, the missing piece settling at last. "And when you reached the house," Inspector Craddock said slowly, "you found him already dying." Edith nodded. "The glass was on the desk. He was clutching his throat. I panicked." "And the key?" Edith opened her handbag. Inside lay an old iron key, its surface smeared faintly with dark, dried mud. "I took it," she said, "and I tried to make it look as though I'd never been there." Inspector Craddock exhaled. "Then you didn't kill him?" "No," Edith said. "But I know who did." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in her hands. At last, the pattern was no longer merely visible, it was complete. Edith Langley did not elaborate at once. She sat very straight, the handbag now open on her lap like an accusation, the iron key resting inside it. Inspector Craddock waited. He had learned that silence was often the most efficient instrument. "It was Clara," Edith said finally. Or rather, it began with Clara. Inspector Craddock's expression did not change, but Miss Marple felt the shift in the room at once. Like a draft from an open door, he went to her first. Edith went on. Arthur always did. He thought youth would bend more easily than age. He believed she would panic, and she did. She came to me afterward, told me everything he'd said, about the mill, about the boy, about money that had changed hands. Miss Marple remembered the look she had seen on Clara Wilmot's face by the hedge, not grief, not fear, but calculation. He asked her to meet him at the mill, Edith continued. She refused. Also, she told me. She said she couldn't bear it, that she felt trapped. Inspector Craddock said quietly, "And you believed her?" Edith's mouth twisted. "I believed she was frightened. I did not believe she was harmless." Miss Marple intervened gently. "Fear often makes people imaginative," she said, "particularly when they see no way out." Edith nodded once. Arthur took something from me at the mill, the key. He said it proved access, that it would interest the police. I followed him back to retrieve it. When I reached the house, I heard voices, not on the lawn. Inside, Inspector Craddock leaned forward. Whose? A man's, and Clara's. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. The pattern tightened. I waited, Edith said. I shouldn't have. But I did. I heard him accuse her again, tell her he had proof and witnesses. I heard her cry. Then she swallowed. Then I heard him coughing, gasping. And you didn't go in? Inspector Craddock asked. No, Edith said hoarsely. I was afraid. Afraid of being seen. Afraid of what I might find. When it went quiet, I went in through the side door and found him dying, Inspector Craddock said. Yes, Miss Marple spoke softly. And the glass? It was on the desk already, Edith said. Clara must have poured it, or added something to it. Inspector Craddock sat back. Cyanide isn't easily come by. No, Miss Marple agreed, unless one knows where to look, or who to ask. Inspector Craddock's eyes narrowed. The school laboratory. Yes, Miss Marple said. Peter Grant is very conscientious. He keeps his cupboards tidy and unlocked. Edith looked up sharply. You think he helped her? I think he would do anything to protect her, Miss Marple said gently, even things he later regretted. Inspector Craddock stood. Then we'll speak to them, separately. They found Clara Wilmot in the small bedroom Mrs. Compton had offered her, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing. Peter Grant hovered nearby like a guard dog. Inspector Craddock asked him to leave. Peter protested but left. Alone, Clara's composure crumbled with astonishing speed. I didn't mean to kill him, she said at once. I only meant to frighten him. He was ruining everything. Miss Marple watched her, her expression kind, almost grandmotherly. You meant to settle things, Miss Marple said softly, just not quite so finely. Clara buried her face in her hands and sobbed. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook. Outside, the village lay quiet beneath the stars, unaware that the truth had finally found its voice, and that it had been far closer and far more ordinary than anyone had wished. Clara Wilmot's confession, once begun, spilled out in a rush that was almost incoherent. Words tangled over one another, grief and self-justification entwined so tightly that neither could be separated cleanly. Inspector Craddock let it run its course. He had learned that people told the most truth when they were not interrupted. Miss Marple sat slightly to one side, her hands folded in her lap, her head inclined as though listening to a sermon she had heard before. In many ways she had. I only wanted him to stop, Clara said brokenly. He liked the power of it, watching people squirm. He said if I didn't meet him, he'd go to the police, to the governors, to everyone. She laughed weakly. He even said he could make Peter lose his post. Inspector Craddock's pen paused. So you went to the mill? No, Clara said quickly. I was afraid. I went to Edith instead. She always knew what to do. She told me to keep calm, that she would deal with him. Clara's voice wavered, but I couldn't leave it. I knew he'd come to the house afterward. He always liked to feel safe when he was being cruel. And the poison? Inspector Craddock asked. Clara hesitated, then whispered Peter. Miss Marple watched her face closely. There was guilt there, yes, but also something else. Relief. The relief of having shifted the heaviest part of the burden. He didn't know, Clara said quickly. Not really. I told him I needed something to make Arthur ill. Just ill to frighten him. Peter, he trusts people. He left me alone in the lab for a moment. Inspector Craddock said nothing. I put it in the glass, Clara went on. Just a little. I didn't know. She stopped shaking. I didn't know how little was too much. Silence fell again, thick and final. Later, when Clara had been taken away, and Peter Grant sat pale and stunned in the drawing room, Miss Marple asked him, quite conversationally, whether he always kept the laboratory unlocked. Yes, he said miserably. I never imagined. No, Miss Marple agreed. One rarely does. She watched him carefully as she spoke of cyanide, of how quickly it acted, of how unmistakable its effects were. Peter's distress was genuine, but it lacked one crucial thing: surprise. He knew, Miss Marple thought. Not before, but now. And knowing afterward could be almost as terrible. Inspector Craddock joined her by the window. Outside, the lawn lay empty, chairs abandoned, the wreckage of the afternoon cleared away with grim efficiency. "You were right," he said quietly. "About patterns. They always repeat," Miss Marple replied. "People tell themselves their situation is unique. It never is." He regarded her thoughtfully. "You didn't push. You let her speak." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "People are very eager to correct assumptions. One only has to make the wrong one gently enough." Inspector Craddock smiled faintly. "You could have been a fine detective." "Oh no," Miss Marple said. "I only observe what I've seen all my life. Fear, love, and the terrible things people do when they believe they're protecting one from the other." The house felt quieter now, not peaceful, but settled. The truth had found its place, and there was nothing more for it to do. Miss Marple picked up her knitting at last, the familiar weight soothing in her hands. She cast on a new row with care. It was always best, she thought, to keep one's hands occupied. It stopped one from meddling too late. Morning came quietly to Greenley Parva, as it always did, with bird song and the reassuring appearance of milk bottles on doorsteps. The village looked unchanged, which was how it preferred to appear after disturbance, but there was a watchfulness beneath the calm. Curtains twitched more often than usual. Conversations were lowered when footsteps approached. Miss Marple sat by her front window, knitting in her accustomed place. The blue sock was nearly finished now, its shape clear and inevitable. She was counting stitches when Inspector Craddock arrived, removing his hat with a thoughtful air. "I thought you'd like to know," he said. Settling into the chair opposite her without waiting to be invited, "Clara Wilmot has signed her statement. Fully. No dramatics left in her, I'm afraid." "That is often how it ends," Miss Marple said. "People are quite exhausted by the time they've finished deceiving themselves." He studied her for a moment. "There was one thing that still troubled me. You never directly accused her." "Not once." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh no, that would have been quite unnecessary." "How so?" "She was very anxious to be seen," Miss Marple replied. "Anxious to be pitied, anxious to be suspected, even provided it happened quickly and on her own terms. People who want to hide something rarely object to attention. They only object to the wrong kind of it." Inspector Craddock nodded slowly. "And the moment?" "The moment came when you spoke of Peter Grant," Miss Marple said. "Not as an accomplice, but as someone who might suffer. That was quite deliberate on your part, I think." He smiled ruefully. "Perhaps I've learned something." She could not bear that. Miss Marple continued, "Not because she loved him so very deeply, though she did, in her way, but because it destroyed the story she had been telling herself, that everything she did was to protect him. When it became clear that he would be harmed by her silence, the truth became the easier choice." Inspector Craddock was silent for a moment. Outside, a postman passed whistling. "And Edith Langley?" he asked at last. "A tragic woman," Miss Marple said gently. She told herself for years that survival was the same thing as innocence. Arthur Bellamy frightened her because he understood the difference. Inspector Craddock rose. "You have a remarkable grasp of human nature, Miss Marple." Miss Marple returned her attention to her knitting. "One does, after a lifetime of village life. People are always so very similar, Inspector. Only the circumstances change." He paused at the door. "Will Greenley Parva recover?" Miss Marple considered. "Oh yes, it always does. There will be a new scandal soon enough. Something smaller, easier to discuss." After he had gone, Miss Marple finished the last row and cast off the stitches with care. She folded the sock neatly, placing it beside its completed pair. Through the window she could see Mrs. Compton's house in the distance, its curtains drawn back once more, its door open to callers. Life, relentless and polite, was resuming its course. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and poured herself a cup of tea. Human nature, she reflected, was endlessly interesting, but it was comforting to put it down now and again like a piece of work, well and truly finished. Now, generate the final section of the story, ensuring a satisfying resolution. Maintain the logical progression of clues and character arcs, delivering the final reveal smoothly while keeping the ending impactful and true to the detective's style. The village gathered again 3 days later, though this time no one pretended it was for pleasure. Chairs were arranged in the school hall, set out with an anxious precision that betrayed the effort to look orderly. The air smelled faintly of Polish and damp coats. People sat too upright, hands folded, eyes darting. Grinley Parva had come to hear the truth spoken aloud, and it was never quite sure whether it wanted that or not. Miss Marple took a seat near the side, her knitting resting in her lap, untouched. She had no intention of working on it. There were moments, she believed, when one ought to give one's full attention to human behavior, unmediated by wool. Inspector Craddock stood at the front with the calm patience of a man who had learned that the last act of a tragedy was often the most difficult. Clara Wilmot sat in the front row, pale and very still, her hands clasped together so tightly that the knuckles shone white. Peter Grant sat several rows back, staring at the floor as though it might offer absolution. Edith Langley was present too, seated alone, her face composed but drained of its former severity. Inspector Craddock began without flourish. Arthur Bellamy did not die by accident, he said, nor did he die at the mill, where he had arranged to meet more than one person. He died because he believed himself safe, because he thought he had control. There was a faint stir at that. Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. Control, she knew, was always the fatal illusion. He came to Mrs. Compton's house after the meeting at the mill failed. Inspector Craddock continued. He expected to speak privately to someone there. In fact, he spoke to 2 people, one after the other. His gaze rested briefly on Edith Langley. She did not look away. Miss Langley did meet Mr. Bellamy earlier that afternoon. She followed him to retrieve an item he had taken from her, a key connected to the old mill. When she arrived at the house, she found him already poisoned. She panicked, removed the key, and attempted to conceal her prints. These actions were wrong, but they did not cause his death. A murmur ran through the room. Edith Langley closed her eyes once. Inspector Craddock let the sound settle before going on. The poison was cyanide, obtained from the school laboratory. It was placed in Mr. Bellamy's glass after the sherry had been poured. The act was intended to frighten him, not to kill him, but cyanide does not bargain. Clara Wilmot made a small, broken sound. Miss Marple did not look at her yet. Inspector Craddock turned slightly so that he faced the girl fully. Miss Wilmot acted out of fear, he said. Fear of exposure, fear of loss, fear that she had no other way out. Mr. Bellamy used that fear deliberately. He believed he could force compliance by threatening to uncover an old scandal connected to the mill, one that involved money-changing hands and responsibility quietly avoided. Miss Marple thought of the boy who had fallen into the river year before, and of how often villages mistook endurance for virtue. Miss Wilmot did not act alone, the inspector went on, but the person she involved did not understand the consequences of what he provided. That responsibility rests with her. Peter Grant's shoulders sagged, though he did not look up. Inspector Craddock closed his notebook. That is the truth of it. Silence followed, deep and uncomfortable. The village absorbed the shape of the story, already beginning the process of retelling it in safer forms. Miss Marple rose then. She did so slowly, with the faint stiffness of age, and for a moment it seemed possible she might sit down again. But she remained standing, and when she spoke, her voice carried surprisingly well. "If I may," she said gently. Inspector Craddock inclined his head. "I should like to say only this," Miss Marple continued. "Arthur Bellamy did not invent the secrets he threatened to expose. He found them. They were already there, carefully folded away like old letters one does not wish to reread. Her gaze moved across the room, not accusatory, merely observant. He believed that possession of the truth gave him power over people. It often does, for a little while, but truth, like knitting, has a way of unraveling when one pulls too hard. There was the faintest ripple of unease at that. Miss Wilmot believed she was protecting herself and someone she loved. Miss Langley believed she was protecting the village, perhaps herself as well. Mr. Bellamy believed he was protecting nothing but his advantage. Miss Marple paused, then added softly, and all of them were wrong. Clara looked up then, tears running freely now, her face stripped of its careful brightness. "I didn't mean to," she began. Miss Marple met her gaze kindly. "No," she said. "You meant to stop being afraid. That is quite understandable. But fear, my dear, is not something one can poison away." Inspector Craddock stepped forward again, bringing matters back to their necessary conclusion. Arrangements were outlined, statements confirmed. The machinery of justice moved forward with its steady, impersonal rhythm. When the hall began to empty, Miss Marple remained seated for a moment, watching the villagers leave in small groups, already aligning themselves into new patterns of sympathy and blame. Mrs. Compton paused to squeeze her hand, eyes shining with unshed tears. Edith Langley passed without a word, but her glance held something like gratitude, or perhaps simply relief. Outside, the afternoon was mild. Spring had advanced without consulting anyone, and the hedges showed new green at their tips. Inspector Craddock walked with Miss Marple as far as the gate. "You were right from the beginning," he said, "about the shoes and the mud." "Oh," Miss Marple replied, "those were only little things. They rarely are," he said. "Not to you," she smiled. "One learns, Inspector. People rarely change. They only repeat themselves in slightly different circumstances." He hesitated. "Will you miss the excitement?" Miss Marple looked back toward the village, where life was already resuming its gentle insistence. "No," she said thoughtfully, "I never care for excitement. It upsets one's digestion, but I do care for understanding, and that at least has been achieved." She walked home alone, the path familiar beneath her feet. In her sitting room, she took up her knitting at last and finished the final sock, smoothing it carefully before placing it with its pair. The needles fell silent. Outside, Greenleigh Parva returned to its routines, chastened but intact. Secrets had been brought into the open, and the village would never quite be the same. But then Miss Marple reflected. It never truly was, no matter how much people insisted otherwise. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the light fade. Human nature, she knew, was endlessly fascinating, but it was also terribly predictable. And that, she thought, was both its greatest danger and its greatest comfort.